light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. A lot of times people talk about belongingness as if belonging to a category in some sense of the word somehow made them a member of that category, whether or not they actually are. And a lot of times I try to contemplate that more deeply and to figure out, am I a member just because someone said I'm a member, or do I belong simply because I'm part of a category that somebody named? And what exactly does the word belonging mean anyway? And in dealing with my own life and not knowing that I was autistic long before I was diagnosed as a person with autism, my sense of self and the ways that I identified and related with the world began at a very individual level, because from the very beginning, I was noticing details that other people were overlooking. And so I would interpret things and come to a conclusion more quickly than they did. And that's where in one of my previous shows I made the comment that sometimes I think it's the neurotypicals who are disabled because they're going through life with everything always a little bit out of focus, never seeing the details that are so obvious to me. And so when people said that I belong to the Midwest because I grew up in southern Wisconsin, and I would ask, yes, but what does that mean? Because everywhere I went, people would treat me as if I didn't belong. And when I was in high school, I had kind of picked up on this unspoken message from the society around me, I suppose, that in a small town in the Midwest, one either had to conform, leave, or die. Those are the only three options. And since I couldn't conform, I saw what I saw and I felt what I felt, and I was myself, no matter what. No matter how hard I tried to be what they wanted, to be the embodiment of others' expectations, I very early in life detected that I would never be able to be. If there's one thing I've never been, it's normal. And the word normal, I've been told, is a setting on the washing machine, and really has no relevance beyond that. And a lot of people seem to say that, but I don't see too many people living like they actually believe it. Because when there is no normal, then you have the freedom to embrace every individual you meet as a complete individual. If there is no such thing as a normal white person, a normal black person, a normal Asian person, a normal U.S. American, a normal Central American, a normal South American, a normal European, there are as many ways to be any category you want to name as there are people. There are as many ways to be gay as there are gay people, as many ways to be lesbian or to be non-binary or to be whatever. And so there really needs to be a lot more dialogue about, yes, but what does that mean to you? And when you use that word, what does that mean? Or do you avoid words of categorization altogether? That race and nation and so forth really don't tell the other person who we are. And yet, having said that, I think it's important for each of us to do some contemplation, to do some self-reflection on the ways that we embody or diverge from what the perceived norm is. If somebody perceives that everyone in the United States behaves a certain way, do I ever behave that way? Under what circumstances do I behave that way? If I never behave that way, where did they get that idea? They got it from someplace. I was talking with someone about stereotypes once, and the idea came up that actually the stereotype we had of Texans was all based on the city of Houston and nothing else, or the city of Dallas and nothing else. And the stereotype that we had of California was all based on Orange County and nothing else. And I suppose if you did some investigation, you might find that even Orange County did not completely universally affirm the stereotype that this person with whom I was speaking and I had the stereotype of California is such and such, but of course we know it's not true. It's just a general idea pertaining to a category that a certain group of people have or not. But when people use this word in conversation, what do they mean by it? And the funny thing is that a lot of times I found that people don't really even know what they mean, because most people don't seem to take the time to define their terms. And I know as I was going through my master's program, and now as I'm going through my doctoral program, that's something that offends me about academia quite often, that they use words in very unique ways, but they don't take time to define their words. So you have to guess by reading their essay or lecture or whatever how exactly they define that term, because chances are they will define the term differently than you've ever heard it before. Or you might have heard it from some people but not others. And so, do I really belong? There was one day, I still remember like it was yesterday, and because the theological school that I went to for my master's degree obsessed about racism in a way that was so unbalanced and inaccurate, it was ridiculous. And the only racism they were prepared to see was a white perpetrator and a black victim. And I finally asked someone, when I'd heard all their absurdities for the umpteenth time, what is a white person? And they went on for 5 minutes describing everything they knew about white people. And when they finished, I looked at them and shook my head and I said, there is not one thing you named that has any relevance to my life experience. So if I'm not white, what am I? And of course, I look at a sheet of paper and hold it up to my face and I say, yeah, see, I'm not white. And of course, if you take a black piece of cloth and hold it up to a black person, they're not black. But it doesn't matter if we stop chasing the categories. This whole thing of belongingness, the fact that you are alive means you belong. There was a plaque I saw once that said, children are God's idea that the world should go on. And I thought that was an interesting statement, regardless of what belief or not somebody has about a divine being. The idea that when a child is born, it's some kind of message from somewhere that somehow life should continue. And that the point at which no children are born anywhere is the point at which the universe is telling the human species, you've had your turn, it's time for life to end, and for the life of the human race, of the human species, not to continue. I sometimes stumble over the phrase human race because it's like the one plaque said, why do they call it a human race if nobody ever wins? The human species. And I'm trying to get more consistent in my language that way, but chasing the categories and trying to put things in categories and expecting people to embody categories. And if they embody that category, then they belong. And if they don't embody that category, then they don't belong. And part of me, to use the witticism, wants to say, who died and made you God? Who decided that you belong or don't because of some categorization that they imposed on you without even knowing who you are? Is a teacher because they have a certificate or because they convey information from themselves to someone who doesn't yet know? And on a similar note, if the teacher doesn't know, are they a teacher because they help someone discover something new, to come to a new understanding, a new perception? Does that make them a teacher? What makes them a teacher? I guess I would say the fact that they're teaching. But there are so many ways to do that. And waiting for someone else to declare you a teacher, now you're a teacher before you weren't, yeah, right. If you meet someone who didn't understand, and by your questions or by your answers, by your experience, by whatever it is that worked, you help that person come to a new understanding, that's teaching. You may not have intended to do it, but you did it. In a similar sort of way, because of my attention to detail and consequently might need to constantly deconstruct things and figure out, but why did they call it that? And why does it work? And if this does this and we call this this, then why don't we call that that? Um, it's kind of like the joke someone put forth once. Why do we park in a driveway and drive in a parkway? Um, Language is a funny thing, and English is certainly not an exemplary language, but it's the one I grew up with, so it's the one I use. It's a backwards and of course that joke wouldn't translate to other languages because they don't have the same distinctions. If we tried to translate the show into Spanish, for example, I don't know whether they have the words driveway and parkway in a way that corresponds to what happens in English. And of course, in similar ways, there are things you can say in Spanish that if you try to translate them to English, won't readily translate because they don't have words for our understandings and we don't have words for their understandings. They have words that reflect their understanding and reflect their perspective. And we have words that reflect our perspective and understanding. And people in every country around the world have words that reflect their perspective and understanding. This is why when I was studying German in high school, my teacher instructed at one point that you don't really know the language until you know the people who speak the language, because the language reflects how the people form concepts and relationships and what relates to what. And if this thing is derived from that, or if it's not derived from that, but it has some commonalities and it looks the same as that, then we might call it by that even though it has no connection. Which of course brings me back to the wonderful exception of the platypus, that an animal native to Australia, and yet a lot of animals in Australia kind of defy all the rules, and they embody things that no one knows how to explain. And when the platypus was first discovered in Australia, they actually had to send a live one to the United Kingdom, to Great Britain, because no one would believe that it was a real animal. The first one they sent back that they had shot and killed, someone thought it was a taxidermist joke. And they said, no, this is a real animal. And they said, yeah, sure. So they had to send a live platypus from Australia all the way to England before people were willing to believe that such an animal could exist. In a similar way, when you meet somebody totally eccentric and unusual, the fact that this living, breathing, talking person is standing in front of you means that that sort of person exists. And if your words and your categories are not adequate to encompass that person's reality, the problem is not with that person's reality, the problem is with your categories. You need a new category. You need a new word. You need a new way of defining people, a new way of considering all the possibilities of being a person. Supposedly, they can now prove the existence scientifically of 10 genders. In the world I grew up, there were only 2, male and female, and that was it. Well, correction. In the world in which I grew up, there were actually 4 genders. There were male and female and priest and nun, because a priest was not a man and a nun was not a woman. They were 2 different categories that were considered to be asexual, which of course has different problems with it. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. In every case, it manifests in as many different ways as there are people. In my understanding, those 2, the third and fourth roles were defined by their commitment to service, not by their gender. And with that in mind, there are now women who are priests, and in my case, men who are nuns. But the point is not the gender, not the orientation, but the commitment to service. That this isn't about whether I fit into your expectations. This is about helping you find the next step in your personal growth. That wherever you are and whatever you find yourself to be, there is a next step to pursue. And there is a different way of looking at things to embrace. In a similar sort of way, when the people in Great Britain came into contact with a platypus, they had to radically expand their definition of what a mammal could be. And the notion of a platypus, a mammal that lays eggs, this was unheard of. And it totally made them rewrite their dictionary because their word for mammal didn't encompass a platypus, but they finally decided that a platypus was a mammal because it had all the other characteristics, even if it didn't have that one. So the challenge that we're left with in terms of the people we encounter is that each person we meet can be a different way of being. And in the same way of talking about race and deciding this is the category, and then we meet somebody who doesn't fit the category, to say that maybe instead of categories, we need to focus on individuals. And we need to talk to a person long enough and listen long enough to find out who that person is, who he or she or they is. And hopefully our language will catch up. The problem with English, of course, is that there are some people who have chosen the pronoun they because we don't have a neutral pronoun that it doesn't relate to being male or female. The problem with that is that they is also used for plural sentences when you talk about more than one person. So it kind of invites the question, is this someone struggling with multiple personality syndrome, or what's going on here? And hopefully they're not struggling with multiple personality syndrome, though I have met a few people who are. The point, though, is creating language that serves its purpose, creating a word for our third gender, or for whatever gender you are, that doesn't confuse the listener with whether you're talking about yourself as a unique individual or yourself as a person with multiple personality syndrome. But the bottom line is communication, that we ask this person questions and they provide us responses, even if they don't have conclusive answers. The more we insist on categories, the more we come to blows, I guess, even, or the more we are at odds with the fact that no individual is the embodiment of a category. There's no white person who can represent all white people. There's no black person who can represent all black people. No Asian who can represent all Asians. No lesbian who can represent all lesbians. Every category is uniquely defined according to the specific individual in front of you. My personal definition of racism, therefore, is that racism is something that blinds you to the truth of the person in front of you. Racism is a form of chasing the categories instead of recognizing the truth of the individuals. Instead of asking, how do you self-identify? And what relationships are important to you? And how do you interact with this situation when you go there, or do you avoid going there? To learn how many more different ways of being there are. And in that, to understand that there are that many more ways of being available to us. That if we don't fit people's categories, and if we don't fit their expectations and their sense of norms, it's okay. It's an opportunity for both of us to grow. It's an opportunity to have dialogue and communicate and expand our definitions of how many ways there are to be. In all of that, however, it brings me back to this question of belonging and asking, so why is it so important that I belong in the first place? And to some extent, I think it's because, like cattle, like lots of animals, big cats and cattle and goats and even birds. I mean, there's a lot of animals, perhaps the majority of them on the planet. There are some that don't, but there are a lot of animals that orient to herds, to being with others of their kind, to being with others, period. I've seen dogs and cats grow together and they form family for each other when there are no other dogs and cats available. But the point is that they don't want to be alone. And so in one sense, I understand when we want to belong, but I think what needs to change is our definitions of belonging, it's not that we should erase the need to belong. It's that we need to find broader definitions so that more people can belong. So that if they're not just like us, it's okay. It kind of reminds me of the movie Muppets from Space, in which the Muppets are trying to be supportive And Gonzo is finding out that his origin was actually in outer space. And he's getting messages of a sort to go to this particular beach at this particular time. And Kermit tries to confront him on all this and say this is weird and wacky and goofy, and it's time for us to go home. And Gonzo responds, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I have to go to the beach, and I have to meet whoever's going to meet me there. And Kermit stares at him a long time and finally says, then I guess we're going to the beach. Because it's not about whether or not family always understands. It's what is tied into the definition of the word family, in my opinion, is that it has to do with having a commitment to each other and with supporting each other and being there for each other. And that when the whole world runs the other direction, or when you're standing in the road and you're about to be hit by a car, somebody in your family will grab your hand and jerk you out of the road and get you out of danger's way. That whatever danger is headed toward you, family comes together as a group and stands with you and gets you out of harm's way and helps you find your way to whatever answer works for you. You know, in Gonzo's case, they went to the beach and they waited with him, even though they didn't understand why or what they were supposed to do or anything else. And at the last minute, as they're about to give up on the whole thing and wonder if it's just some pipe dream, lo and behold, the extraterrestrials show up. And they're all very glad to be there. But the point was that they were sufficiently committed to Gonzo to stand with him in his hour of need. That even when they didn't understand, they were still willing to be present. And even if his words made no sense, they were still saying, we still love you. And because we love you, we're going to be there. And if, in my understanding, the only people who would legitimately be homeless would be people with no families, because a true sense of family would insist that even if you have to sleep on the living room floor, you are not going to be homeless as long as we're your family. The problem, of course, is that you have families where dysfunction occurs and they don't want each other. You know, my own family has been estranged from me for over 30 years. They don't want an openly gay person in their lives, and so I chose to respect their choice and stay away. But that means when the holidays come around, I have no family, because everyone goes to their biological families and I have none. So on Christmas Day, it's me and my dogs watching the day pass, watching television and crocheting or whatever it is that I want to do to spend the day, maybe working on a book manuscript or something. And my dogs and I are family to each other, but there's no other family available. And I am far from the only one in that situation. And so it caused me to wrestle with the question of what do you do when there is no family? And that's where I kind of looked up, and said some prayers, did some meditation, read some books, and finally came to the conclusion, came to the question, I guess, how essential really is family? And on one hand, I don't want to say they're not essential, because I find there's a lot of love and a lot of pragmatism, utility. There's a lot of good things that can come from being family. And ideally, if you don't have a family, if your biological family doesn't want you, ideally there is still a way for you to choose family and choose who your family members are and find people who will demonstrate that commitment and stand with you in your hour of need and invite you to stand with them in their hour of need. I haven't found that to always be true, because there are people who wanted me to think of myself as their family, but in my hour of need ran the other way, because what I was dealing with was not something they wanted to face. It wasn't something they wanted to understand. They had no real commitment to me. And so, in one sense, this sense of belongingness, it's something we need, but it's also something that is a societal construction, and it's not real. And yet, at a more basic level, the fact that you're alive means you belong to life. The fact that you have a voice means you belong to those who speak. The fact that you have a body means you belong to those who act. The question is, how will you choose to speak and act and be within the context of your own life? how will you take whatever life throws at you and turn it into something wonderful? That if what you are given is the equivalent of ugly, sticky gray clay from the riverbank, that you will take that clay and mold it into porcelain. By your investment, it started as ugly clay, it finishes as porcelain. And it may take some time, and it may take the pressures of heat and all sorts of conditions to make that transformation happen. It doesn't mean the transformation shouldn't happen. Just because it's work, just because it takes a bit of a fight, doesn't mean you should give up. Just because churches and synagogues and religions of all sorts throughout human history have done it wrong and have totally confused people and even abused people psychologically and emotionally and even physically, just because they have always done it wrong doesn't mean you should give up on finding a way for spirituality to be done right. And I am here and I am interested in helping in any way I can, whatever you find your next step to be. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that the comments of the last half hour have been helpful to you.